All right. Looks like I am live. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I think I wanted to experiment with setting up my live stream ahead of time today, and I'm planning on doing that a bit more in the future. So there's time, I think, ahead of time to let people trickle in and get set up. So thank you for being here and waiting as we dive into this wonderful anthology today. Before I get started, I wanted to give a shout out. I put a link in the description of my live stream and later a video of a channel that I think if you're interested in learning about hidden figures in Black history, specifically Black women, you should subscribe to this channel. I subscribed to Sensei Aisha Tamasu for a few years now. I don't remember where I first came across her videos. I think it might have been Facebook. I'm not really positive, but you know, when you talk about like women who are like really care about what they're doing, if you want to know more, I would suggest really subscribing to her channel and digging through all of the content that is there, because it's like really great. She's been doing these Black History Month things for years. Well, I mean, she also does it periodically, you know, as well. So I just wanted to give a shout out to, you know, a Black woman I think you should follow and learn from. What else do I want to say before we get started? I don't know. How's everybody doing? As well, I think I'll say that. How is everybody? I hope you're all well. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves. And yeah. Oh, I'm glad that you are subscribed to her too. Well, for anybody who isn't, you should be. You really should be. All right. So this book I thought would be good to share because, you know, it was recommended to me years ago when I was in Radical Women as a really important part of Black feminist history. It's kind of like the first formation of a Black women's studies. You know, all of that stuff coming together. This book is important in that history. It was first published in 1982, and it, I think, is a real kind of like piece of treasure that, you know, is an important part of why I think it's crucial that when we talk about things like identity politics, that we understand where it comes from, and it's specifically about issues that only people who are impacted by those issues really can address and change, you know. And I think that this book is a part of learning about that. And it includes like so much important work as well. So yeah, the book won 2 awards here. I don't know if it's won more at this period, but here it has the seal that says it won the Outstanding Women of Color Award and the Women Educators Curriculum Material Award. So in terms of like a piece of study, this is a really great piece of work. It was edited by Gloria T. Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith, who, you know, I adore. So anyway, let's look at the book. This is the first image that we have, but some of us are brave. Third world women, we cannot live without our lives. This image is from 1981. It says, Here's the title page. All the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. I mean, I remember the first time, like, I heard that, and I was like, I think, you know, that really kind of conveys a lot of what we see Black women struggling with and why it's so important to, like, give space for Black women to express themselves, because there's a lot that they are contending with as women and as Black people in this world, and as being both and carrying the weight of both, you know, projections. So it was published by the Feminist Press at the City University of New York. And, oh, goodness. It's amazing how boring my channel is, and yet people still want to troll it. Like, it can't really be that boring, can it? Because people get their jollies here. Punching down. It's really gross. All right, so this book is dedicated for Beverly Towns Williams, whose commitment and generosity helped make this book possible. This is a woman seated at the Tuskegee Institute in 1906. Table of Contents has some interesting stuff in it. Let's make this a little bit clearer. The kind of introductory sections, there's a piece called Women by Alice Walker, a foreword by Mary Berry, Introduction, The Politics of Black Women's Studies by Gloria T. Hull and Barbara Smith, Visions, Recommendations for the Future of Black Women's Studies. Okay, so the first chapter is Searching for Sisterhood, Black Feminism. So I want to read a little bit from this section. You know, there's some interesting stuff. There's even the Combahee River Collective statement, which I think is crucial. I think, you know, I don't know if anybody wants me to read through the entirety of it, because I think it's one of those things that is crucial in terms of understanding, like, feminist history. I think especially U.S. feminist history, which I'm hoping to, like, convey here with some of the things I'm sharing. That statement was really profoundly impactful and still has, like, reverberations today in the political landscape. So I think if you haven't read it, it's important. But yeah, I also am interested in what Michelle Wallace's piece is about. There's a bit of that I wanted to kind of share as I was, like, reading through. Second chapter is called Roadblocks and Bridges, which is about confronting racism. One Child of One's Own, a meaningful digression within the works. An excerpt, that's by Alice Walker. Racism, a White Issue. I wanted to read from that. Racism in Women's, okay, that's by Ellen Pence. And Racism in Women's Studies by Barbara Smith. Is my audio echoing again? I'm having such audio issues. It's really frustrating. Give me a second, everybody, and I want to address that, because, you know, I have multiple microphones, and they all seem to be, like, each of them has their own challenge, right? So irritating. This is part of the fun of being live, though, isn't it? It's like dealing with these annoyances. So I'm going to plug in this microphone and see if it's a little bit better. Sorry about that. Thanks for letting me know. Please let me know if anything's ever off, okay? Because, like, I want it to be good. Within reason, anyway. I'll wrap this around here. Hello to Shannon and Seth and Grace. Thank you for also being here, as well as, Matthew, who I've already said hi to. Okay, let me deal with this. Okay, so hello, hello. Wonderful. Wonderful. I am glad that this is better. Okay, thank you for all bearing with me while I get my audio settings together. All right. So anyway, back to the work and talking about the contents and what I'm hoping to share with all of you. Face-to-face, day-to-day racism, CR, Tia Cross, Frida Klein, Barbara Smith, and Beverly Smith. 3, dispelling the myths, Black women and the social sciences. So, studying slavery, some literary and pedagogical considerations of the Black female slave by Erling Stetson. Debunking Sapphire, towards a non-racist and non-sexist social science by Patricia Bell Scott. 2, representative issues in contemporary sociological work on Black women. That's by Elizabeth Higginbotham. 4th chapter is called Creating Survival, Preserving Body and Mind and Spirit. Preserving Body, Mind, and Spirit. Black Women's Health, Notes for a Course by Beverly Smith. Three's a Crowd, The Dilemma of the Black Woman in Higher Education by Constance Carroll. Slave Codes and Liner Notes by Michelle Russell. Black Women and the Church by Jacqueline Grant. Actually, I think I'm interested in reading that. What do you all think about Black women in the church? I think that would be very interesting because I've put my foot in my mouth a few times with like progressive Black women by like knocking Christianity, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a Christian actually," and I'm like, "Okay, fuck." But you know, it is a big aspect of like Black women's lives in America, and a lot of like progressive Black activism has come through organizing through the churches. So I think that's an important aspect to kind of consider when we're having these discussions. Teaching Black-Eyed Susans, An Approach to the Study of Black Women Writers by Mary Helen Washington. Okay, 6, bibliographies and bibliographical essays. Afro-American Women, 1800 to 1910, a selected bibliography by Jean Fagan Yellen. Afro-American Women Poets of the 19th Century, a guide to research and biobibliographies of the poets by Joan R. Sherman. On the novels written by selected Black women, a bibliographical essay by Rita B. Dandridge. Black women playwrights from Grimke to Shangi. Selected synopsis of their work by Jean-Marie A. Miller. American Black women composers on a selected annotated bibliography. I'm kind of interested in Black women composers, aren't you? I don't hear much about that at all. Like, I hear about poets and writers and even other things, but composers? That's interesting. I think we could look through that, hopefully. That is by Ora Williams, Dora Wilson, Thelma Williams, and Ramona Matthewson. Okay, so 4 women contributed to that piece. That's interesting. A listing of non-print materials on Black women. Oh, that might be interesting as well. That's by Martha Brown and then additional references and resources. 7, doing the work, selected course syllabi. General social science and interdisciplinary, and then literature. And then about the contributors, and then acknowledgments in the index. Okay, and as you can see, this book is pretty thick, It's pretty thick. So we're obviously not going to read everything in it, but I do want to expose, those of you who haven't seen this work to the kind of treasure that exists in some of these books and the kind of ways in which women have endeavored to preserve our history. So I'm glad to be sharing this with you all, and thank you for being here. All right. So this is, oh wow, this is an image of an evicted sharecropper in Butler County, Missouri, November 1939. Wow. Imagine her life. This is the poem Women by Alice Walker. I think I'll read it to you all. They were women then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands. How they battered down doors and ironed, starched white shirts. How they led armies, head ragged generals across mined fields, booby-trapped kitchens to discover books, desks, a place for us. How they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves. So let's see. Was this the piece I wanted to read? There was some section from the introduction that I wanted to read. Oof. I did want to read Vision and Recommendations, which they don't really put in the front of the book, but this is, I think, an interesting bit. Our visions and recommendations for the future of Black women's studies are myriad. Countless projects and areas of research connecting Black women have not even been conceptualized. The following are merely examples. Many of our visions require financial and institutional support. We would like to encourage funding of individual research by Black women scholars, funding of teaching projects and curricular materials, funding of summer seminars for college teachers like those sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, funding of a directory of who's who and where in Black women's studies, funding of a Black women's research institute at an institution with significant holdings on Black women, funding of a national interdisciplinary Third World Women's Studies Conference, funding to allow the creation of our own publications, including both academic and Black feminist movement journals. Already existing institutions can and must respond to the following needs and recommendations. That university departments provide a climate open and supportive to the teaching of materials on Black women. That universities and individual departments make hiring, promotion, and tenure of Black women faculty a priority and fulfill affirmative action directives. That universities implement more programs for re-entry women with particular outreach to third world and working class communities. That Black women's studies programs be made accessible to all Black women, not only those who are in universities. Word. That Black women's studies programs be implemented on the elementary and secondary levels. That journals make a serious effort to identify and publish the work of Black women scholars, particularly their research on Black women. And accreditation of women's studies programs on the basis of their approach to and inclusion of third world women's studies. I think all of that is worthy of support. Oh, and there's more. Accreditation of Black and third world studies programs on the basis of their approach and inclusion of third world women. All of our visions require fundamental social, political, and personal change. For Black women's studies to flourish, we call for the creation of the eradication of racism, not the creation, sorry, the eradication of racism in the white women's movement through a serious examination of their own racism and a recognition of Black history and culture. The eradication of anti-feminism and homophobia in the Black community, and particularly among Black women academics. A strong Black feminist movement supported both by white feminists and by the Black community. So quite vital things that they're calling for here. This image is on the cover. The women are not named. They are two young women, probably somewhere in Virginia, 1910. So I don't know how they came across this image. I believe this image is in the Library of Congress, okay? But I'm just, look at these outfits alone. I mean, my goodness. Do you know how like strong women had to be to like wear that kind of stuff? Like the kind of constitutions that, you know, the women that came before us had to even have to wear clothes that were that like cumbersome. Ah, Michelle Chaton's here. Hello. It is unfortunate that, yeah. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but I'm laughing because I'm uncomfortable because it's like, yeah, it hasn't happened, has it? And that's shitty. But it's also like totally what needs to have happened. It still needs, I mean, knowing what still needs to happen and what hasn't been accomplished, I think is really important as we talk about like moving forward in the world, right? You know, it's just like a lot of things haven't been dealt with that need to be dealt with. All right, so the first section, Searching for Sisterhood, Black Feminism. A Black Feminist's Search for Sisterhood. This is by Michelle Wallace. I want to say going into this that Michelle Wallace was and has been a very controversial figure. And as a Black woman who she's been through a lot. Okay, so I want to acknowledge, like, before reading any of her work here, how much she has worked to distance herself from some of her like feminist work, and she has made statements to the effect that she was taken advantage of by white women, white feminists specifically, and that even as parts of her book, Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, weren't written by her, and I think that's kind of concerning. So her work is still very important today. She's big in the prison abolition movement and just advocating for Black people in America generally. So I really recommend following her and like getting plugged in with her work, period. She's just a very like, she's been through a lot. I just want to say that. She has been through some shit. And, her boldness, it's been really important, I thought I wanted to read an aspect of this because I thought it spoke to me about like kind of where I'm coming from in terms of like trying to examine my own femininity as such and like work on that as a human being. Some of the statements she makes here are part of like why, as a white woman, I think it's important to do that. Because white women are considered to be the feminine standard, and that social capital comes at the cost of like other women specifically, what is considered to be beautiful like internationally is the white standard. I don't want to say it's internationally, but what is pushed on people internationally is this like white standard of beauty, and this has a real impact on like specifically, Black girls, but like girls from all sorts of different places around the world. Like these issues like that, I don't know, as a feminist, I felt like really it's important because it's like where are we privileged, and where can we like challenge ourselves to like step away from it and kind of take a stand against it. So like part of my like anti-femininity is that part of it is that kind of hope that Black women could have the kind of world where their womanhood isn't judged by like how up to these kind of standards. I'm really rambling here. I should just read the fucking work, right? I'm just gonna read the fucking work. So my ramblings at like trying to explain myself are less interesting than Michelle Wallace's words. Okay, so I'm going to share this with you. On rainy days, my sister and I used to tie the short end of a scarf around our scrawny braids and let the rest of it silken mass trail to our waists. We'd pretend it was hair and that we were some lovely heroine we'd seen in the movies. There was a time when I would have called that wanting to be white. Yet the real point of the game was being feminine. Being feminine meant being white to us. One day when I was 13, on my bus ride home from school, I caught a brief but enchanting glimpse of a beautiful creature, slender, honey brown, and she wore her hair natural. Very few people did then, which made her that much more striking. This was a look I could imitate with some success. The next day I went to school with my hair in an afro. On my way out of my building, people stared, and some complimented me, but others, the older permanent fixtures in the lobby, gaped at me in horror. Walking the streets of Harlem was even more difficult. The men on the corners who had been only moderately attentive before now began to whoop and holler as I came into view. Becoming exasperated after a while, I asked someone why. They think you're a whore, sugar. I fixed my hair and was back to normal by the next morning, letting the world in on the secret of my native naps appealed to my proclivity for rebellion. But having people think I was not a nice girl was the war already, and I was not prepared for it. I pictured myself in a police station trying to explain how I'd been raped. Come on, baby, you look like you know your way around. sneered an imaginary policeman. In 1968, when I was 16 and the term Black consciousness was becoming popular, I started wearing my hair natural again. This time, I ignored my elders. I was too busy reshaping my life. Blackness, I reasoned, meant that I could finally be myself. Besides recognizing my history of slavery and my African roots, I began a general house cleaning. House cleaning. All my old values gathered from playing house in nursery school to glamour magazines, beauty tips were discarded. So yeah, I mean, as I was like glancing through this again and looking at what to kind of share, you know, from this anthology, I thought that little bit from this was interesting and was kind of something to examine and to think about. The entire piece is very interesting, and it kind of details how she, you know, moved from this like Black consciousness state to like embracing feminism, and like how like these different aspects of things that she experienced, not just as a Black person, but as a Black woman, you know, like I want to like be clear too, like Black women are way more policed around like issues of femininity than, you know, Black men. They don't get as much shit for wearing their hair natural, right? It's just, it's not as much of a political issue, or, you know, different aspects of this kind of thing. You know, it's the femininity and whiteness aspect, I think, are like really important to examine. Really important to examine. So anyway, I really appreciate this piece. What do you all think about me reading the Cohambie River Collective statement? I think it might be good for anyone who hasn't heard it here. Like, has anyone, I guess what I want to say is, anyone here not heard this or read this statement? If that's the case, then I'll read it. That's a damn shame. Responding to Mashant Chatan's comment. Okay, so we've more than one person has not heard this. Okay, so this is serious stuff. Okay. All right, cool. I'm glad you're here then. I'm glad that we're exposing folks to things that are new. That's awesome. All right. Also just want to like kind of look through the comments. I see a lot of good stuff happening here. I think there's just a lot of good stuff in the comment section here today. So I want to thank people for, you know, being open and talking about this stuff. Sometimes, you know, anyway, sometimes these issues are really hard to talk about, and I think people get uncomfortable, and I want to like challenge like that more, you know, like, okay, we're uncomfortable, but like, so what? And I think the comments about like that Mashant Chatan says about like femininity and like, you know, just when I think about like, when I think about these issues, I just think about like in this culture, who is held up as like normal is really important. And then when you see like the various with a with oppression and each binding of oppression, there seems to be like even greater level of projection that happens, So anyway, I think that's part of like what like someone like Michelle Wallace has had to deal with. And I also agree because I'm at a point too with like my work where I kind of want to like move on from a lot of things I've done and like separate myself from some of it. Not even because I disagree necessarily, but because it's like, I don't know, it's not helpful about the work I want to do. Do you want to come here or not? Come here. All right. He's not coming here. This is a Black feminist statement by the Combahee River Collective. We are a collective of Black feminists who have been meeting together since 1974. During that time, we have been involved in the process of defining and clarifying our politics, while at the same time doing political work within our own group and in coalition with other progressive organizations and movements. The most general statement of our politics our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. As Black women, we see Black feminism as the logical political movement to combat the manifold and simultaneous oppressions that all women of color face. I'm sorry, I want to get my cat over here. Why don't you come here and read this with me? Come on. All right. Why are they like this? We will discuss 4 major topics in the paper that follows. 1. The genesis of contemporary Black feminism. 2. What we believe, as in the specific province of our politics. 3. The problems in organizing Black feminists, including a brief history of our collective. And 4. Black feminist issues and practice. 1. The genesis of contemporary Black feminism. Before looking at the recent development of Black feminism, we would like to affirm that we find our origins in the historical reality of Afro-American women's continuous life and death struggles for survival and liberation. Black women's extremely negative relationship to the American political system, a system of white male rule, has always been determined by our membership in 2 oppressed racial and sexual castes. As Angela Davis points out in Reflections on the Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves, Black women have always embodied, if only in the physical manifestation, an adversary stance to white male rule and have actively resisted its inroads upon them and their communities in both dramatic and subtle ways. There have always been Black women activists, some known like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frances E.W. Harper, Ida B. Wells, Barnett, and Mary Church Terrell, and thousands upon thousands unknown who had shared awareness of their sexual identity combined with their racial identity to make their whole life situation and the focus of their political struggles unique, Contemporary Black feminism is the outgrowth of countless generations of personal sacrifice, militancy, and work by our mothers and sisters. A Black feminist presence has evolved most obviously in connection with the second wave of the American women's movement, beginning in the late 1960s. Black, other third world, and working women have been involved in the feminist movement from its start, but both outside reactionary forces and racism and elitism within the movement itself have served to obscure our participation. In 1973, Black feminists, primarily located in New York, felt the necessity of forming a separate Black feminist group. This became the National Black Feminist Organization, NBFO. If you all would give me a moment, I need to grab my cat and see what his deal is. So I will be right back. Enjoy this little intermission to do whatever you need. But yeah, he's up to something like big, and he's very upset with me for not paying attention to him. So just give me a second. Honey, what are you doing? Hey, you don't belong in there. Hey, come on. Don't be mad at me. Be mad at me. Come here. Why don't you come read with me? Huh? Why don't you come read with me? Say hi to the people. Come say hi. Come say hi. Come say hi. Yeah. Hi, everybody. All right. It was my fault. It was all my fault, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay to want attention. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay to want attention. Attention is nice. Yeah. All right. Here we go again. Let's see. Where was I? Black feminist politics also have an obvious connection to movements for Black liberation, particularly those of the 1960s and 70s. Many of us were active in those movements, civil rights, Black nationalism, the Black Panthers, and all of our lives were greatly affected and changed by their ideology, their goals, and the tactics used to achieve their goals. It was our experience and disillusionment within these liberation movements, as well as experience on the periphery of the white male left, that led to the need to develop a politics that was anti-racist. Ooh, you are not nice today. To develop a politics that was anti-racist, unlike those of white women, and anti-sexist, unlike those of Black and white men. There is also undeniably a personal genesis for Black feminism, that is, the political realization that comes from the seemingly personal experiences of individual Black women's lives. Black feminists and many more Black women who did not define themselves as feminists have all experienced sexual oppression as a constant factor in our day-to-day existence. As children, we realized that we were different from boys and that we were treated differently, for example, when we were told in the same breath to be quiet, both for the sake of being ladylike and to make us less objectionable in the eyes of white people. As we grew older, we became aware of the threat of physical and sexual abuse by men. However, we had no way of conceptualizing what was so apparent to us, what we knew was really happening. Black feminists often talk about their feelings of craziness before becoming conscious of the concepts of sexual politics, patriarchal rule, and most importantly, feminism, the political analysis and practice that we women use to struggle against our oppression. The fact that racial, politics, and indeed racism are pervasive factors in our lives do not allow us, and still does not allow most Black women, to look more deeply into our own experiences and to find those things that make our lives what they are and our oppression specific to us. In the process of consciousness raising, actually life sharing, we began to recognize the commonality of our experiences, and from the sharing and growing consciousness, to build a politics that will change our lives and inevitably end our oppression. Do you hear this? Do you hear what I am subjected to? I want you all to witness the kind of drama queen nonsense that I have to deal with day in and day out by this cat. Unreal. Okay. Our development also must be tied to the contemporary economic and political position of Black people. The post-World War II generation of Black youth was the first to be able minimally partake of certain educational and employment options previously closed completely to Black people. Although our economic position is still at the very bottom of the American capitalist economy, a handful of us have been able to gain certain tools as a result of tokenism in education and employment, which potentially enable us to more effectively fight our oppression. A combined anti-racist and anti-sexist position drew us together initially, and as we developed politically, we addressed ourselves to heterosexism and economic oppression under capitalism. All right, I'm just going to feed him even though it's early. So, I'm sorry, y'all. One more intermission. I will be back. Because, yeah, he is not happy with me. And I can't have him doing this the entire time. So, I'll be right back. And, again, my apologies. Okay, I'm coming. All right. I know. I know. I know. I know. Here. Yeah, yeah. I'm terrible. Worse. Bad human. Oh my God. Ah! Give me a moment. Like, oh. He's just so demanding. It's like, all right, dude. All right. Precisely. I'm glad you all find it humorous. It's good. It's good that he's taking up space and teaching me to be more responsive. But it's also humbling to like be doing this process publicly a little bit. Like, okay, let's go take care of this, regardless of what's happening. All right. You know, I just realized I didn't show you all the back of this book. These are the editors. And there's like a statement from Audre Lorde, exciting affirmations and the beginnings of a new era where the women in women's studies will no longer mean white. And then Adrienne Rich said, this is a necessary bread for women of all colors. The essays contain not only the fact and durable resources, but some of the best writing I've seen around. And then Geraldine K. Brookins, a clear statement about Black women. Congratulations to the editors for compiling such a fine interdisciplinary volume. Okay, so pretty cool. Let's see, where was I? I think in order to better read this, I'm gonna flip it around, and I hope you all, I don't think you're reading along with me, so that's fine. A combined anti-racist and anti-sexist position drew us together initially, and as we developed politically, we addressed ourselves to the heterosexism and economic oppression under capitalism. What we believe. Above all else, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, but because our need as human persons for autonomy. This may seem so obvious as to sound simplistic, but it is apparent that no other ostensibly progressive movement has ever considered our specific oppression a priority or worked seriously for the ending of that oppression. Merely naming the pejorative stereotypes attributed to Black women, examples mammy, matriarch, sapphire, whore, bulldagger, let alone cataloging the cruel, often murderous treatment we receive, indicates how little value has been placed upon our lives during 4 centuries of bondage in the Western Hemisphere. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation is us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. Woo! Whew. That is what identity politics is about. And that is why I think little statements like that, who cares more about Black women and who has ever done more for Black women than Black women? It's about understanding that, the people who are best equipped to serve us are ourselves, and the importance too of having space for that. So, I'm trying to just kind of hammer that home a little bit. I know I like to beat a dead horse on this channel, but I think this is why you don't bash identity politics. Stuff like that. Messages like what we're reading right here in this statement. The focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of Black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. We believe that sexual politics under patriarchy is as pervasive in Black women's lives as are the politics of class and race. We also often find it difficult to separate race from class, from sex oppression, because in our lives they are most often experienced simultaneously. We know that there is such a thing as racial sexual oppression, which is neither solely racial nor solely sexual. Example, the history of rape of Black women by white men as a weapon of political repression. Although we are feminists and lesbians, we feel solidarity with progressive Black men and do not advocate the fractionalization that white women who are separatists demand. Our situation as Black people necessitates that we have solidarity around the fact of race, which white women, of course, do not need to have with white men, unless it is their negative solidarity as racial oppressors. We struggle together with Black men against racism, while we also struggle with Black men about sexism. We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political, economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed amongst those who create these resources. We are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. We have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of Black women, who are generally marginal in the labor force, while at this particular time, some of us are temporarily viewed as doubly desirable tokens at white-collar and professional levels. We need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant detriments in their working economic lives. Although we are in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it is applied to the very specific economic relationships he analyzed, we know that this analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as Black women. A political contribution which we feel we have already made is the expansion of the feminist principle that the personal is political. In our consciousness-raising sessions, for example, we have in many ways gone beyond white women's revelations because we are dealing with the implications of race and class as well as sex. Even our Black women's style of talking, testifying in Black language about what we have experienced, has a resonance that is both cultural and political. We have spent a great deal of energy delving into the cultural and experiential nature of our oppression out of necessity, because none of these matters have ever been looked at before. No one before has ever examined the multi-layered texture of Black women's lives. An example of the kind of revelation conceptualization achieved through consciousness raising occurred at a meeting when we discussed the ways in which our early intellectual interests had been attacked by our peers, particularly Black men. We discovered that all of us, because we were quote-unquote smart, had also been considered quote-unquote ugly, as in smart ugly. Smart ugly crystallized the way in which most of us have been forced to develop our intellects at great cost to our social lives. The sanctions in the Black and white communities against Black women thinkers are comparatively much higher than those against white women, particularly ones from the educated middle and upper classes. As we have already stated, we reject the stance of lesbian separatism because it is not a viable political analysis or strategy for us. It leaves out far too much and far too many people, particularly Black men, women, and children. We have a great deal of criticism and loathing for what men... What are you doing? Sorry, we have a great deal of criticism and loathing for what men have been socialized to be in this society, what they support, how they act, and how they oppress. But we do not have the misguided notion that it is their maleness per se, as in their biological maleness, that makes them what they are. As Black women, we find any type of biological determinism a particularly dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic. We must also question whether lesbian separatism is an adequate and progressive political analysis and strategy, even for those who practice it, since it so completely denies any but the sexual sources of women's oppression, negating the facts of class and race. And I would say that, while this statement is, critiquing separatism, I also think it's important to, try and... I think one thing that I need to get more in touch with myself is work written by specifically Black lesbian separatists, and that has been something that I haven't gotten, but I know that they exist. So I think that is, I think probably my next, will be my next foray into like digging deeper, because I want to say that while they're making these statements, there are also like Black women who have chosen to be separatists. And I think that's also an important understanding why. And the fact also that, well, apart from just like choosing to be separatist, like challenging racial, class, and class distinctions is a big part of like lesbian separatist history. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's important too. So anyway, and other third world women too. I mean, specifically when I think of like third world women, I also think of like women who aren't in the US. And in many cases, like, they are living, a lot of lesbians I've known, like in what are called third world countries, they do have like separatist communities, that are vital to their work. So I think that's also important to consider. And I think it's also the point of like, what I'm trying to bring here with that is like, it's important to not, it's important to just try to understand where others are coming from sometimes. And I understand where these women are coming from, but I also think that like, too, this ended up being, this is like collected and being put for like, how are we going to teach Black women's studies in universities? So I also think that like understanding that aspect of this and how it's compiled and what it's for is also important. Women rejecting men never get funded the way that like women who agree to work with men do. So I think that's important as well. Anyway, there's my critiques. Problems in organizing Black feminists. During our years together as a Black feminist collective, we have experienced success and defeat, joy and pain, victory and failure. We have found it very difficult to organize around Black feminist issues. Difficult to even to announce in certain contexts that we are Black feminists. We have tried to think about the reasons for our difficulties, particularly since the white women's movement continues to be strong and to grow in many directions. In this section, we will discuss some of the general reasons for the organizing problems we face, and also talk specifically about the stages in organizing our own collective. The major source of difficulty in our political work is that we are not just trying to fight oppression on one front or even two, but instead to address a whole range of oppressions. We do not have racial, sexual, heterosexual, or class privilege to rely upon, nor do we have even the minimal access to resources and power that groups who possess any one of these types of privilege have. The psychological toll of being a Black woman and the difficulties this presents in reaching political consciousness and doing political work can never be underestimated. There is a very low value placed upon Black women's psyches in this society, which is both racist and sexist. As an early group member once said, we are all damaged people merely by the virtue of being Black women. We are dispossessed psychologically and on every other level, and yet we feel the necessity to struggle to change our condition and the condition of all Black women. In a Black feminist search for sisterhood, Michelle Wallace arrives at this conclusion. We exist as women who are Black, who are feminists, each stranded for the moment, working independently because there is not yet an environment in this society remotely congenial to our struggle. Because, being on the bottom, we would have to do what no one else has done. We would have to fight the world. Matthew, if you're talking about like the move, the assault on the Move Collective in Philadelphia. I mean, we just had the anniversary of that coming through, and yeah, a lot of the leaders are still in prison. I became familiar with that because of the work of the political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. So, you know, his support of the Move and involvement with Move is also kind of something I think to look at. But I think, yeah, I mean, this is these things, the political repression done against all like black radicals in in the U.S. is, it cannot be. How do I put this? It's constant. It's constant. The level of sabotage that the U.S. engages in trying to stop black people from organizing on their own behalf, or just really anybody, like, this is why they come for them, because they're like trying to address community needs. And if you're addressing community needs, you're acting as a small government yourself. And that presents a real challenge because it really highlights the fact that the US government is not meeting the needs of a lot of people, who are its citizens. So, I mean, that's let me breathe deep. I really love this piece, but it brings up a lot of heavy stuff, and then, talking about other things that have happened just historically in the US. It's pretty scary stuff. I might sneeze. No. Yes? Okay. Wallace is not pessimistic, but realistic in her assessment of Black feminists' position, particularly in her allusion to the nearly classic isolation most of us face. We might use our position at the bottom, however, to make a clear leap into revolutionary action. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. Feminism is nevertheless very threatening to the majority of Black people because it calls into question some of the most basic assumptions about our existence, as in that gender should be a determinant of power relationships. Here is the way male and female roles were defined in a Black nationalist pamphlet from the early 1970s. We understand that it is and has been traditional that the man is the head of the house. He is the leader of the house and nation. Because his knowledge of the world is broader, his awareness is greater, his understanding is fuller, and his application of this information is wiser. After all, it is only reasonable that the man be the head of the house, because he is able to defend and protect the development of his home. Women cannot do the same things as men. They were made by nature to function differently. Equality of men and women is something that cannot happen even in the abstract world. Men are not equal to other men, as in ability, experience, or even understanding. The value of men and women cannot be seen as in the value of gold and silver. They are not equal, but both have great value. We must realize that men and women are a complement to each other because there is no house or family without a man and his wife. Gee, that is horrible. Ugh. Both are essential to the development of any life. I just want to say too, like, what a family is like a really problematic fucking thing. And if you here they're defining a family as a man and his wife and whatever they produce. And that's a really dangerous concept of family. And it also is a real betrayal of what most Black families in America fucking look like. Because in the US, it's generally Black women who are the heads of the family. So this is a complete contradiction of fucking reality. Yuck. Oh, God. Okay. The material conditions of most Black women would hardly lead them to upset both economic and sexual arrangements that seem to represent some stability in their lives. Yes. Many Black women have good understanding of both sexism and racism, but because of the everyday constrictions of their lives, cannot risk struggling against them both. The reaction of Black men to feminism has been notoriously negative. They are, of course, even more threatened than Black women by the possibility that Black feminists might organize around our own needs. They realize that they might not only lose valuable and hardworking allies in their struggles, but that they might also be forced to change their habitually sexist ways of interacting with and oppressing Black women. Accusations that Black feminism divides the Black struggle are powerful deterrents to the growth of an autonomous Black women's movement. Still, hundreds of women have been active at different times during the 3-year existence of our group, and every Black woman who came out of a strongly felt need for some level of possibility that did not previously exist in her life. When we first started meeting early in 1974, after the National Black Feminist Organization's first Eastern Regional Conference, we did not have a strategy for organizing or even a focus. We just wanted to see what we had. After a period of months of not meeting, we began to meet again late in the year and started doing an intense variety of consciousness raising. The overwhelming feeling that we had is that after years and years, we had finally found each other. Although we were not doing political work as a group, individuals continued their involvement in lesbian politics, sterilization abuse, and abortion rights work. Third World Women's International Women's Day activities and support activity for the trials of Dr. Kenneth Edelin, Joanne Little, and Inez Garcia. During our first summer, when membership had dropped off considerably, those of us remaining devoted serious discussion to the possibility of opening a refuge for battered women in a Black community. There was no refuge in Boston at the time. We also decided around that time to become an independent collective, since we had serious disagreements with NBFO's bourgeois feminist stance and their lack of a clear political focus. We were also contacted at that time by socialist feminists with whom we had worked on abortion rights activities, who wanted to encourage us to attend the National Socialist Feminist Conference in Yellow Springs. One of our members did attend, and despite the narrowness of the ideology that was promoted, at that particular conference, we became more aware of the need for us to understand our own economic situation and to make our own economic analysis. In the fall, when some members returned, we experienced several months of comparative inactivity and internal disagreements, which were first conceptualized as lesbian and straight split, but there was also the result of class and political differences. During the summer, those of us who were still meeting had determined the need to do political work and to move beyond consciousness raising and serving exclusively as an emotional support group. At the beginning of 1976, when some of the women who had not wanted to do political work and who had also voiced disagreements stopped attending of their own accord, we again looked for a focus. We decided at that time, with the addition of new members, to become a study group. We had always shared our reading with each other, and some of us had written papers on Black feminism for group discussion a few months before this decision was made. We began functioning as a study group and also began discussing the possibility of starting a Black feminist publication. We had a retreat in the late spring, which provided a time for both political discussion and working out interpersonal issues. Currently, we are planning to gather a collection of Black feminist writing. We feel that it is absolutely essential to demonstrate the reality of our politics to other Black women, and believe that we can do this through writing and distributing our work. The fact that individual Black feminists are living in isolation all over the country, that our own numbers are small, and that we have some skills in writing, printing, and publishing makes us want to carry out these kinds of projects as a means of organizing Black feminists as we continue to do political work in coalition with other groups. Black feminist issues and practice. During our time together, we have identified and worked on many issues of particular relevance to Black women. The inclusiveness of our politics makes us concerned with any situation that impinges upon the lives of women and those of third world and working people in general. We are, of course, particularly committed to working on those struggles in which race, sex, and class are simultaneous factors in oppression. We might, for example, become involved in workplace organizing at a factory that employs third world women, or picket a hospital that is cutting back on already inadequate health care to a third world community, or set up a rape crisis center in a Black neighborhood. Organizing around welfare or daycare concerns might also be a focus. The work to be done and the countless issues that this work represents merely reflect the pervasiveness of our oppression. Issues and projects that collective members have actually worked on are sterilization abuse, abortion rights, battered women, rape, and healthcare. We have also done many workshops on Black feminism on college campuses, at women's conferences, and most recently for high school women. One issue that is of major concern to us and that we have begun to publicly address is racism in the white women's movement. As Black feminists, we are made constantly and painfully aware of how little effort white women have made to understand and combat their racism, which requires, among other things, that they have a more superficial comprehension of race, color, and Black history and culture. Eliminating racism in the white women's movement is by definition work for white women to do. Yep, but we will continue to speak to and demand accountability on this issue. In the practice of our politics, we do not believe that the end always justifies the means. Many reactionary and destructive acts have been done in the name of achieving correct political goals. As feminists, we do not want to mess over people in the name of politics. Woo! Woo! Let me read that again. As feminists, we do not want to mess over people in the name of politics. Woo! All right. We believe in collective process and non-hierarchical distribution of power within our own group and in our vision of a revolutionary society. We are committed to a continual examination of our politics as they develop through criticism and self-criticism as an essential aspect of our practices. In her introduction to Sisterhood is Powerful, Robin Morgan writes, I haven't the faintest notion what possible revolutionary role white heterosexual men could fulfill, since they are the very embodiment of reactionary vested interest power. As Black feminists and lesbians, we know that we have a very definite revolutionary task to perform, and we are ready for the lifetime of work and struggle before us. All right, let's take a little breath. What did you all think of that statement? For those of you who just heard it, I think, thank you for listening to me read through the full thing, but I think it's like a really important part of American feminist history is like knowing about that particular statement and the kind of ideas they put forward and how it kind of influenced Black feminism. It's still influencing generations today. So it's like really important. I think there was another, there's really great bibliographies in this book. So if you're looking for like historical pieces to understand Black women's history, it has it. All right, so here's a nice image. This is from London, Ohio. The main street on Saturday afternoon, London, Ohio, summer 1938. So section 2, roadblocks and bridges, confronting racism. So the first piece is the one by Alice Walker. It's an excerpt about her, I think, motherhood, that kind of thing. I don't really want to read through it. I wanted to read to you all today, definitely, this is a small little section. It is Racism, a White Issue by Ellen Pence. Earth Angel says, I'm only interested in Wangari Maathai and the others fighting pipelines. Well, I think that's important work. It's also like, it's also Black History Month, and it's important to like center Black women at this time too. So like, that's what I'm trying to do, because I think I told you before or I said before on this channel that I was approached by a Black woman in my life who had complained that I wasn't doing enough for Black women. So I'm, I'm trying to correct that and do more, to make myself uncomfortable in this regard. So I would ask that be respected, and also think about I think it's important to be about what we're for more than what we're against too. Critique is good, but it's also important that we're building and not tearing down. So, other oppressed people are not in our way. That's, I guess, what I have to say about that. So, Racism, a White Issue by Ellen Pence. I've written and rewritten this article only to find that because I am still only in the early stages of seriously examining my own racism and the racism in the battered women's movement, I am unable to articulate much of what I think needs to be said. I grew up in a home where my father believed and preached the natural superiority of whites. Because his racism was so blatant, it was easy for me to reject his ideas during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Marching with Father Gropey for open housing in Milwaukee, sending my babysitting money to Martin Luther King, and making sure that I always went to confession to the Black priest in our lily white parish were all signs to me that I rejected the racist philosophy my father taught and had joined with the third world people in their struggle for liberation. As I began to get involved in neighborhood organizing, and especially in the battered women's program, I watched Blacks and Indians accuse white feminist women of racism. Certainly they didn't mean me. I had marched in Milwaukee. I too was oppressed by the white male. So when I heard women of color speaking of white privileges, I mentally inserted the word male, white male privileges. I viewed the anger of women of color towards my white sisters as a cop-out. I think that's really fucking common. I want to say, just from what I have seen in my own experiences, the way it's talked about sometimes, and you see how, just, the unwillingness to even fucking, deal with it, when it comes up. It's just, ugh. We are the most vulnerable to this anger. We listened and tried to adjust. It seemed to me that because it is much easier for them to confront us than the racist system or the men in their communities who give no support to their participation in women's issues, we are the most aggressively confronted. I also defended the decision-making process we used in developing grassroots organizations as totally open to all women. In response to complaints of exclusionary practices, special care is always taken to notify minority organizations and women of color of conferences, planning meetings, job openings, and workshops. Gradually, I began to realize the tremendous gap between my rhetoric and solidarity with third world women and my gut feelings. I began talking to a Black friend of mine, Ella Gross, about how sick I was getting of the whole issue. Ella, in her normal, blunt, direct way, told me that I was sick of it because I didn't want to go past adjusting my behavior to recognizing my racism. And the many, many hours I spent talking to Ella, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I just like Ella must have been a really awesome woman to like do that. To actually spend hours. I want like white women to also see that who are watching or like, you know, coming across that. If a black woman spends hours on you trying to confront you and talk about racism, I mean, fuck, that's incredible. I don't hear about that happening very often. I see women get fed up really fucking quick. So wow, hours. That's why I'm laughing there. I began to see how white women ignored the need to examine the traditional white rigid methods of decision making, priority setting, and implementing decisions. Our idea of including women of color was to send out notices. We never came to the business table as equals. Women of color joined us on our terms. We never came to the business table as equals. Women of color joined us on our terms. I started seeing the similarities with how men have excluded the participation of women in their work through Robert's Rules of Orders, encouraging us to set up subcommittees to discuss our problems, but never seeing sexism as their problem. It became clear that in many ways, I act the same way toward women of color, supporting them in dealing with their issues, as with liberal men's recognition of the oppression of women. I recognize the oppression of third world people, but never understood that I personally had anything to gain by the elimination of racism. While I fully understand how sexism dehumanizes men, it never crossed my mind that my racism must somehow dehumanize me. As white women, we continually expect women of color to bring us to an understanding of our racism. White women rarely meet to examine collectively our attitudes, our actions, and most importantly, our resistance to change. The oppression of men towards women is in so many ways parallel to the oppression of white women toward women of color. Asking a Black, Indian, or Chicana woman to define racism for us, or to lay the historical background of third world people's experience in this country, is what allows us to continue our resistance to change. The history of racism in this country is white history. We know it. It is the story of our parents, grandparents, and ourselves. Why do we call upon those who have suffered the injustice of that history to explain it to us? Knowing that we grew up in a society permeated with the belief that white values, culture, and lifestyle are superior, we can assume that regardless of our rejection of the concept, we will still act out of that socialization. The same anger and frustration that we have as women in dealing with men whose sexism is subtle, not blatant, are the frustrations and anger women of color must feel towards us. The same helpless feelings we have in trying to escape that subtle sexism must be the feelings of women of color in working with us. I have sat through hundreds of meetings with men, constantly raising issues about women's involvement or the effects of decisions on women, and felt totally frustrating knowing that to them, I'm being petty. My issues are relatively unimportant to the business at hand. My comments resented. I always end up feeling either crazy or absolutely enraged at the thought that they are deliberately acting dumb. I'm now beginning to realize that in many cases, men do not understand because they have never committed themselves to understanding, and by understanding, choosing to share their power. The lessons we've learned so well as women must be the basis for our understanding of ourselves as oppressive to the third world women we work with. We must acknowledge what we think we have to lose by this understanding and find what we have to gain by eliminating our racism. We must believe that racism causes us to be less human and work toward humanizing ourselves.
It seems that much of our resistance to change comes from being angry at women of color. There are many times that white women are put in a real bind, so that no matter what we do, we are accused of being racists. There are times when racism is inappropriately used as an issue, when the disagreements are clearly philosophical. I would like to discuss some of these things that she's saying here. But those often very legitimate resentments we have cannot become a justification for perpetuating our racism. The confusion we feel about when and how this movement is racist will not be cleared up until we understand racism as our issue and our responsibility and begin addressing it among ourselves rather than depending totally on third world women to raise and clarify the issue for us. Mashant Shaitan says, the extent to which I do not want to spend hours talking to someone through racism cannot understate. So, yeah. Yeah. That's just, yeah. Nayako asks, is racism bigger in America, you think, than here in Europe? And I think I get this oftentimes when I have talked to white European women or when issues around racism have come up in terms of like international spaces, which that is really commonplace now because of like social media and the internet. And I've always, as like most of you know, I mean, there are people from different countries on this live stream right now, and it's a small group of people for the most part. So internationalism is a really important value to me. So like when we talk about racism being bigger, when you ask if like racism is bigger in America, I think the fact is that in America, it perhaps is, we culturally deal with it differently. And I think in Europe, a lot of Europeans think that because the racism is different and that they don't have a lot of, I think, you know, in terms of like European women, I want to specifically say like even British women, you know, that I've dealt with, or like I haven't experienced it so much from Spanish women, but like women who live in nations which profited off of the sale of Black bodies in the Americas, you know, don't really understand how like culpable like all, not all European nations, but the major European nations were in part of perpetuating that kind of dynamic. So to say that like Europeans don't have a hand to play in like the chattel slavery system of Africans in America, in the Americas, is really wrong, you know, because Black people, you know, were sold in bondage by many different nationalities, European nationalities. And many people in like from Scotland, from Britain Greater, from um, various places, specifically like Spain, you know, in the Americas, like the Spanish were responsible for importing a lot of slaves, and the descendants of slaves in many places in like Latin America, you know, they're dealing with a lot of the same issues. So like, no. And I also see the way in which like you brought up Schwartz of Pete. Yes, I'm familiar with that character. And, you know, there's been many examples of like really disrespectful blackface. You know, there were many Africans who were, you know, Sarah Bartman is an example. She was brought, a human being was brought and put on display in Europe, and, you know, called like the what was she called? She was like called the Hottentot Venus, you know, her the way in which like Europeans engage in like racism specifically against blacks is undeniable. There's also a great deal of racism against people of, Arab descent as well in Europe. Um, Not just Arab, but like even Turkish or like Persian descent. Um, I think that racism it's an issue in many places, and I've even had known people who lived in like Eastern Asia who've like talked about like the way racism works there and like how, I had an interesting conversation once because I had a coworker who lived in Japan and he's back living in Japan, and he's very thoughtful. He's a very thoughtful person, and somebody had said something about how like white privilege isn't a thing in Japan or it's not a thing in Asia, and he was like he shot it down right away, and he's like a young white man. He was just like, I was made fun of for being white, is what he said. But what I experienced is nothing compared to like what black people face living in like Japan or like different Asian countries. Like, really, it's an issue everywhere. And racism can happen when you have different races interacting, And in Europe, I think a lot of the times there are subtle attitudes about like who really belongs somewhere. So I don't think it's a bigger issue in America. I just think that we have developed a lot more of a cultural around it because like in America, the issue is really black versus white. And, you know, they're always like, oh, well, these are, when you talk about like those kind of things, I've heard Europeans kind of dismiss it, which is a problem because like it's such a big aspect of like American life. Like, yeah, like, oh, that's horrible. Fuck. Right. So like, white privilege is a thing regardless of where you go. Maybe you're not the dominant race there, and as such you may like experience being othered in a way that you're not used to, but like you're still white. I have seen things similarly from other like black people who say that they visited China as well. I also want to say too that like racism against the Chinese is really fucking problematic and common as well. Like with this whole like coronavirus thing and like how like I've seen even like on my like limited social media like that I've seen like a lot of racist images about like how Chinese people eat and like shit like that. And it's like, are there like cultural customs? And it's like, you know, and we have a Korean sister here who says that Asians are racist against each other. And I've seen that as well, Ultimately, these are issues that like, depending on where we're at and what kind of like dynamics we're dealing with, I think the issues are different. But I think like, I'm an American person, so why wouldn't I approach my understanding of racism in terms of where I live and what I am dealing with? Here racism is like I would say it's like described here like as a caste system in the US, and like the ultimate like redemption in the US is money and having that. So I don't know. I don't want to ramble on about that. So racism in women's studies. I want to move on and kind of look so there's this really awesome piece which is about like having discussions face to face, day to day racism, consciousness raising. So why don't we go through like a couple of these sections and like look at like what consciousness raising is. It's like you have a group and you sit down and you ask questions of each other. So here we go. Early memories and childhood experiences. 1. When were you first aware that there was such a thing as race and racial differences? How old were you? Recall an incident if you can. How did you feel? 2. What kind of contact did you have with people of different races? Were they adults, children, playmates? 3. How did you experience your own ethnic identity? 4. How did you first experience racism? From whom did you learn it? What did it mean to you? How did it function in your perception of yourself? How did it make you feel? How did it affect you in relation to other people? When did you first notice yourself treating people of color in a different way? 6. When were you first aware that there was such a thing as anti-Semitism? How old were you? Recall an incident. How did you feel? 7. What did you learn at home about Black people and other people of color? 8. What did you learn about Jewish people? 9. How was what you learned about Black people and what you learned about Jewish people connected? 9. Oh, wait, sorry. 10. What terms did your parents use to refer to Black people and other people of color? If these terms were negative, how did hearing these terms make you feel? Curious, uncomfortable, angry? 11. In the group, say out loud and make collective lists of all the terms you were ever taught or heard about people of color. Also do the same activity with all the terms used for other ethnic and religious groups. Holy shit! Can you imagine? I mean, this is serious work, like actually as adults sitting down and having those kind of conversations. Whoa. I'm going to skip forward. Oh, thank you, Shannon. Shannon has given me a generous donation. So thank you. Anybody who wants to help support this channel can do so through Super Chat, by the way. It is an awesome tool. So you can make a one-time donation, especially for those of you who don't want to do a whole Patreon thing or don't want to get involved in any of that. Like Super Chat is a really cool thing that YouTube provides for users. So thank you for the donation. It's appreciated. So I want to skip forward to this bit about becoming a feminist and dealing with racism in the women's movement because I think that will be pertinent to share here for anyone who may want to do like consciousness raising around racism, especially in your own work. When did you begin to make the connection between your own experiences and the experiences of other women? 2. As you became a feminist, to what degree did you feel connected to women of all different backgrounds and lifestyles? These are important questions to ask ourselves regardless. 3. How do you see yourself as different from a Black woman? How do you see yourself as the same? 4. Think about your relationships with Black and white women who are coworkers, neighbors, and acquaintances. What are the differences resulting from race in these relationships? Have you ever had a really close woman friend who was Black? Can you imagine having such a friendship? Why or why not? Have you ever had a sexual relationship with a Black woman? Can you imagine having such a relationship? Why or why not? 5. How does your class background affect your racism and making connections with women different from yourself? What are the barriers you have to overcome to connect? 6. Everyone in the group fills in the blanks in the following statements. This exercise could be done out loud or by each person writing her response down first before hearing from the group. Black women always blank. So let's do this now. Black women always blank. What do black women always do? You know what came to me just now? Caretake. I think it's like kind of feeding off the last thing we read about Ellen Pence's friend, Ella Gross, the black woman who spent hours with her. Can you imagine the level of caretaking that is? And recently I saw this viral tweet that a black man had shared. I can't remember his name now, but he had interviewed an elderly black lesbian couple, and he remarked about like listening to the audio of his interview with them and how every 5 minutes they were asking him like, are you hungry? Do you need something to eat? Do you need me to cook you something? And I thought this was presented as like, oh, it's so sweet, and like it is, but it's also like, I wonder about like how much of that is like social pressure, and how much that's instilled. And like, even in my own life, black women have like really reached out to like take care of me at times when like other women wouldn't or couldn't even see that I needed help, couldn't even see how challenged I was. They could see it. So, I think that's something that is needed to, right, like needs to like be examined, in my own mindset. Like, why is that something that is so persistent? Okay, when I'm with black people, I always feel or usually feel when I'm with black people, I always feel or usually feel. I don't say I always feel this way, but like sometimes I feel uneasy. Like I need to be mindful and kind of careful, I guess, about like how I act and what I say. I guess I feel like I need to have more discipline and care, and that kind of can lead to a rigidity, I guess, sometimes, because I feel like I need just to be on my best behavior. Because I'm going to be honest with everyone, I have a real case of foot and mouth syndrome as a human being, and I'm really good at saying the wrong fucking thing. And like I said earlier, like making like examining my own life and like the times I've offended black women by like just my flippancy. So I feel kind of like a little bit like I need to be mind my P's and Q's is what they call it. I need to be on my best behavior. And that's kind of like, well, I think it's good. I also think it's like it's there's a level of unease with that, and it's like being honest about that from my own perspective is it's important to be mindful of that and to understand where it's stemming from. Okay, so let's move on. I wouldn't want black people to blank. I think like most white people or just people with like white privilege, I don't want black people to think I'm racist. I don't want that. But then it's like, that's my own shit, right? Right? I wouldn't want black people to blank. I don't think there's any like human activity that I could feel comfortable saying that I don't want black people to participate in. Or like not even feel comfortable saying, but that that's not what I mean. I mean like I don't think that there's anything that human beings do that like isn't or shouldn't be done by Black people. You caught me, Michonne. You caught me. Called the fuck out. Hey, like I said, I don't want that. I feel that way. And that's like, I think understanding that, you know, I think understanding that about myself is like good, you know, and it's in terms of like doing this, like kind of work of confronting that. It's like, all right, I'm carrying around that bullshit of like, for one, caring what people think. That's a problem, you know, as a woman, period. It's like caring about what people think will hold you back. But also like, you know, why do I have this anxiety that I'm like going to be found out, right? It's like what is playing in my fucking mind where that's like an issue. Man, reading this stuff is like reading this stuff is like actually really confronting, you know, in an important way. So I'm glad I pulled out this book today, and thank you for everyone who's like listening to me go through this. And I hope that like for the people who are answering these questions, like themselves, to like be clear about like, and to like really examine what your answers are is what I would suggest. I'm afraid I will blank. Okay, when I'm with Black people, I'm afraid that blank. So I answer that. I'm afraid that I will say something that, okay, so let's answer that, like, and go further. I'm afraid that I will say and do things that hurt Black people without meaning to, because of like my own ignorance or my own like position of power, and it like creates a sense of unease. I also worry that I'm going to put that on them, you know, as well. And really it's like it's a weird charge. It's a weird vibe to like examine, you know, like the this is like challenging our implicit biases, right? So like what am I carrying, or what are any of us carrying when we deal like specifically with Black people, right? Be aware of it, like own it, and like think about like, so I'm afraid that I'm going to like offend or hurt, you know, in some way. And that I will be like that person that was like, like, you know, where we go to this like early memories, childhood experiences, or like racism in the women's movement. I'm worried I'm going to be one of those fucking like life stories that like, you know, that like someone looks back and is like, man, fuck that person. You know, I'm worried about that. Like, am I going to be the one that like does that shit? I don't think I am. Um, but as I said, like, you know, I'm afraid they will. Okay, so I'm afraid they will blank. I'm afraid they will blank. So answering that question, I think what I'm most afraid of is that they won't like want to deal with me or like work with me or like talk to me or like include me, you know. Or I'm afraid they won't like continue to want to work with me, I guess, is like the main fear. Like that if I say the wrong thing or that I offend or that I do something, you know, I do something in that like that mindset that it's going to be like the end, I guess, and that like it's going to be one of those experiences that aren't good, you know. So anyway, Split Second says Black people, like all groups, don't have a hive mind. And I totally agree with that. Oh, I see Grace gave me a donation too. Thank you, Grace. That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I agree that no group has a hive mind, but it's not really about that because, like, regardless of how Black people perceive the world or what ideologies they have or how they think about things, they'll still experience racism, you know? So anyway, thank you for listening to me and letting me like go through this and like talk about that. So, and be transparent as well. And I hope that those of you watch and like potentially consider doing these consciousness raisings in your own community, like, you know, be honest as well. And maybe even write down your thoughts. I think those are good as well. Machant Chaton says, for me, accidental stuff is just whatever, right? But when folks get defensive and or start gaslighting me is what I really remember negatively. Yeah, I think that's paramount, and I think in my own experience too, that's like somebody offending me is like whatever, you know, in terms of how I walk through the world, but it's like when they deliberately like go out of their way to misinterpret me or put it back on me that I get like angry. So I think that's an important piece to consider. I think thinking we can walk through life without offending one another is like dumb because like our views and perspectives are just like so different through life. But like it's where when do we like not let other people who have more knowledge be heard? And where do we like use opportunities to act oppressive? Because being offensive isn't the same as being oppressive. Offense is not to offend, is not to oppress, you know? Although it can contribute to a culture, and not being mindful of these things can contribute to a culture of oppression, you know, how we behave and how we treat people is like important. It's like treat people how you want to be treated, right? Do you want to be gaslit? Do you want to be, when you raise a criticism, do you want to just be met with defensiveness? No. So anyway, thank you for your comments. 7, discuss different values you think white and Black women have about family, sexuality, child rearing, clothes, food, money, upward or downward mobility, and other issues. 8, how does racism affect your daily life as a white woman? The group could discuss Lillian Smith's statement from The Winner Names the Age. Backdoor treatment is humiliating to all who participate in it. Both leave stains on the soul. Let me read that again. Backdoor treatment is humiliating to all who participate in it. Both leave stains on the soul. 9. Each week, the group has the homework assignment of noticing racist situations, things each member sees, hears, or reads. Begin each session by sharing the things you have noticed. 10. Discuss what happens when you confront another white woman about her racism. What are your fears? How does it feel to do this? Not good in my experience. Not good. Because, like, even if you're a white woman confronting another white woman's racism, you're likely to be met with the dismissiveness, defensiveness, and gaslighting. So, like, that's the other thing. Like, just bringing up the issue of racism alone. Like, I'll tell you, like, critiquing, like, for example, like, European women's racism in the past. What has happened? The fucking gaslighting. You know? The defensiveness and the gaslighting. Like, oh, we don't have the same racial problems. Well, it doesn't mean you don't have racism. Fuck. Racism is racism. Damn. You know, that kind of shit. I'm swearing a lot today. I hope you are enjoying it. It's part of my cultural background to swear. So I hope you enjoy that as you watch my channel. Um, 11. In what way does being a lesbian connect to the whole issue of racism between white and black women? What kinds of racism have you noticed in all women's social situations, at bars, and at cultural events? In what ways can shared lesbian oppression be used to build connections between white women and women of color? I don't think I want to answer that now, but I think, that is something to think about. 12. Discuss the ways in which white women lower their standards for being feminist. Ooh, 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 ooh. Drum roll, please. Discuss the ways in which white women lower their standards for being feminist for Black and other third world women. Do you find yourself hiding your feminism in a situation where there are third world people? Are you afraid to confront Black women's anti-feminism? Again, things to consider. 13. Discuss issues that the women's movement has worked on which might be considered racist because they did not address the experiences of women of color. Discuss feminist issues that cut across racial and class lines, touching the lives of all women. Which of all these issues have you worked on or considered a priority? All right, this is a beautiful shot as well. Women welders at Landers, Prairie, and Clark Plant, New Britain, Connecticut, June 1943. Section 3, Dispelling the Myths, Black Women and the Social Sciences. I think this was a section that I kind of wanted to glance over but not really read, just because it's like the social sciences, when we start getting into discussing that kind of stuff, I get kind of overwhelmed. Studying Slavery, Some Literary and Pedagogical Considerations on the Black Female Slave by Erlene Stetson. Quite a long section. I mean, there is a lot to consider, and when you look at the dynamics of slavery and how they affect the Black community today, I mean, it's specifically the social position of Black female slaves. I think it's important stuff to look at, but it's also a lot to uncover. I'm going to just read a little bit of this section, Debunking Sapphire Toward a Non-Racist and Non-Sexist Social Science. The term sapphire is frequently used to describe an age-old image of Black women. The caricature of the dominating, emasculating Black woman is one which historically has saturated both the popular and scholarly literature. The purpose of this paper is to debunk the sapphire caricature as it has been projected in American social science. By exposing the racist and sexist understandings of the stereotype, one hopes that more students and scholars might be sensitized and encouraged to contribute to the development of a non-racist, non-sexist social science. The novice to the subject of Black women's studies generally encounters feelings of frustration as she or he begins to explore the literature in quest of more knowledge relevant to the experience of being Black and female in America. One is almost overwhelmed with the depth and extent of the of the intellectual void that exists among social science scholars concerning the life experiences of Black women. Those persons who somehow manage to endure the frustrations involved in unearthing bits and pieces of data about Black women are further exasperated by the following observations. 1. Despite the fact that Black women have always played important roles in American society, they have been almost totally ignored by students of American society and human behavior. From reading the literature, one might easily develop the impression that Black women have never played any role in this society, and that they represent only a minute percentage of the total American population. 2. The experiences of Black women in both a historical and a contemporary sense have been discussed from a very narrow perspective. Their lives have been examined from a problems framework. Let me turn this around just so I can read it better for you all. As Black women, as a result of this approach, the student begins to see the experiences of Black women as being limited in nature and certainly in no way comparable to the life and times of great white men. 3. The themes, hypotheses, and images used to explicate the experiences of Black women have not been significantly altered in the past 40 years. As a result of the stagnant nature of the literature in this area, the beginning student might hastily, yet erroneously, conclude that the story of Black women in America is one which is uninteresting and outworn. Therefore, there is no point in delving for more insight into the dynamics of the situation. These observations reflect a pervasive racist and sexist bias in social science scholarship. The more one begins to investigate the theoretical frameworks, concepts, methodologies, and jargon of American social science, the more glaring and ungrounded the racist and sexist assumptions become. Okay, so let's continue through here a little bit. This is a smaller section. Okay, so we're coming on a new section. This is a group at Tuskegee Institute, 1906. Creative Survival, Preserving Body, Mind, and Spirit. Black Women's Health, Notes for a Course by Beverly Smith. The health of Black women is a subject of major importance for those of us who are committed to learning, teaching, and writing about our sisters. Exploring this topic is a way of discovering how we are broken physically and mentally in this oppressive society, and also finding out how we have struggled and survived. The politics of Black women's health, reproductive health, diseases of Black women, mental health, Black women health workers, sexuality, violence against Black women, battering, rape, violence against children, and then the general analyses and descriptions. So, I mean, like, she came up with basically this entire list of things to, like, study and look at in terms of understanding, like, you know, what happens to Black women in this culture from specifically Black women's perspective. So again, like this document is, this book, this anthology is such an important document to have in terms of like understanding the work that has happened. You know, and I think too, like one thing that I struggle with just in terms of like trying to like convey how important how important this kind of like work is as feminists is like preserving our history. Like women have worked so fucking hard and it gets buried, you know? So having like documents like this and understanding that they were created with an intention to like create a different future is like, it's really important. I mean, a lot of people just do not realize how much women's participation in this culture at large has been erased and like what women have done for women. It's like, It's not convenient history, so we don't learn it. So this is why we have to learn it ourselves. Three's a crowd. The dilemma of being of the Black woman in higher education. So I'm just going to kind of this is interesting. Okay, prior to my experience with the Chancellor's Advisory Council on Women's Opportunities at the University of Pittsburgh, and my experience and involvement with the women's movement, I had unquestionably accepted what I conceived to be the Black woman's role. I functioned by the tacit formula followed by all Black women who wish to succeed in a man's, both black and white, world. Ooh, let's read this. You must be better qualified than the men. You must be more articulate. You must be more aggressive. You must have more stamina to face the inevitable setbacks. You must have more patience, since you will advance more slowly. Above all, you must remain feminine and not appear threatening. I have found that Black women share these dicta with white women. However, Black women have an extra step in the syllogism which white women do not have. That is, they must also be better than white women. It is this seldom discussed fact which has generated bitterness towards white women in general. In a power ladder, the white woman is seen to be 2 steps removed from the power, but the Black woman is 3 steps removed. The Black woman cannot help being cautious in aligning herself with a privileged competitor. Slave Codes and Liner Notes, Michelle Russell. It was either live with music or die with noise, and we chose rather desperately to live. Ralph Ellison. What are we studying when we look at Black women's experience once inside the United States? Documents for sure, bills of sale for cargo received. Agricultural production figures for tobacco, cotton, cane sugar, and rice in 10 million pound units. The diaries of white women on the subject of concubinage and household management. Ugh. The plantation ledgers of their husbands, calculating the dollar discrepancy paid for mulatto versus full-blooded African children, both bred for comparative advantage on the domestic markets. This range of material yields important insights, primarily having to do with the peculiar barbaric variable of slavery in United States settler culture fostered. Sometimes in genteel circles, it goes by the name of breeding. It meant wholesale rape for profit. There are other dimensions to the story, other documents. The vivid descriptions Black men have left of us escaping bondage, inciting rebellion among field workers, killing overseers, wrecking property, and protecting family. These are legion. Their perspectives are those of husbands, brothers, sons, co-workers, poets, and the collectors of lore. They demonstrate that we did not take rape lying down. They are the ways others reacted to our being and doing, the stereotypes of the dominant culture, which created Aunt Jemima, Sapphire, Topsy, Pinky, Farina, and Sweet Thing. The biological metaphors which told us, in no uncertain terms, what kind of animal Anglo-Americans thought us to be. The consequence of those ideas in action, the spits and cross ties where we were roasted after the hunt, our mutilated body parts smoked and sold as trophies. And again, in rebuttal, there are works of art, skill, and craft created by us in bondage that give the lie to myths of our primitive savagery and sloth. But above everything else tower Black women's own voices, raised in resistance to death and slavery, of the body and spirit. They cut a record in continuous performance, expressing the restless movement of a captive people for whom home is far away and heaven is out of sight. It is an old song with many verses, but just one refrain, freedom. It starts with a humming, which kept alive African rhythms in spite of the lockstep ankle chains demanded, and the rocking of the slave ship's hold. It continues in the work shouts, which coded our pain. It rose on Sundays and in the nighttime wilderness from which Harriet Tubman signaled us to steal away because we were so tired of this mess. And closer to our own time, it is carried in the music of 5 women over the last 50 years. Bessie Smith, Bessie Jackson, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Esther Phillips. In helping Black women own their past, present, and future, these figures are primary. The content of their message, combined with the form of their delivery, make them so. Blues, first and last, are a familiar, available idiom for Black women, even a staple of life. In the poorest city homes, records or a radio are the second purchase after a hot plate. Sometimes before, for the rural and the homeless, songs are always present. We all know something about blues. Being about us, life is the only training we need to measure their truth. They talk to us in our own language. They are the expression of a particular social process by which poor Black women have commented on all the major theoretical, practical, and political questions facing us and have carried a mass audience who listens to what we say in that form. Bessie Smith, Bessie Jackson, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Esther Phillips recall the worst aspects of our collective situation and teach how to wring from that the best transformation consciousness can achieve at precise moments in history. They are the bearers of the self-determination tradition in Black women's blues, unsentimental, historical, materialist. They are not afraid to name a job a slave, a marriage a meal ticket, and loving a grind. They all recreate our past differently, but each in her own way and for her own day travels the road from rape to revolution. Their rendering of that process is high art. The beat they step to goes like this. And then this piece continues on, so she documents Bessie Smith and some of her lyrics and songs. Bessie Jackson, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone. Let me read this lyric to you. Nina Simone was not the first to be so direct. In the 1930s, Bessie Smith could say to the rich, "While you're living in your mansion, you don't know what hard times mean. A working man's wife is starving. Your wife is living like a queen." Here's that section, Black Women in the Church, that I mentioned earlier. I just want to do a time check. It's 2:18. I've been on here for 2 hours, and it's interesting how quick the time can go by. So I think, I want to be clear about what I read moving forward and just kind of be mindful about time, because I am human and fallible, and while I enjoy doing this, I will have to get off. So I'm just kind of looking at what I want to look at moving forward. So yeah, Black women in the church. Black women in the church. It is often said that women are the backbone of the church. On the surface, this may appear to be a compliment, considering the function of the backbone in the human anatomy. Teresa Hoover prefers to use the word glue to describe the function of women in the Black church. In any case, the telling portion of the word backbone is back. It has become apparent to me that most of the ministers who use this term are referring to location rather than function. Ooh. What they really mean is that women are in the background and should be kept there. They are merely support workers. This is born out of my observation that in many churches, women are consistently given responsibilities in the kitchen, while men are elected or appointed to the important boards and leadership positions. While decisions and policies may be discussed in the kitchen, they are certainly not made there. She brings up a black woman in history called Mrs. Jarena Lee, who was a gospel preacher. In the early 19th century, Reverend Richard Allen perceived that it was unjust for blacks, whether free or slaves, to be relegated to the balcony and restricted to a special time to pray and kneel at the communion table. Yet because of his acceptance of the patriarchal system, Allen was unable to see the injustice and relegated women to one area of the church, the pews. By withholding ordination from women, as he did in the case of Mrs. Jarena Lee, Lee recorded Allen's response when she informed him of her call to go and preach the gospel. He replied by asking, "In what sphere I wish to move?" I said, "Amongst the Methodists." He then replied that of Mrs. Cook, a Methodist lady who had sometimes before requested the same privilege, who it was believed that had done much good in the way of exhortation and holding prayer meetings, and who had been permitted to do so by the verbal license of the preacher in charge at the time. But as to women preaching, he said that our discipline knew nothing at all about it, that it did not call for women preachers. Because of this response, Jarena Lee's preaching ministry was delayed for 8 years. She was not unaware of the sexist injustice in Allen's response. Oh, how careful ought we be, lest through by our bylaws of church government and discipline, we bring into disrepute even the word of life. For as unseemly as it may appear nowadays for a woman to preach, it should be remembered that nothing is impossible with God. And why should it be thought impossible, heterodox, or improper for a woman to preach, seeing the Savior died for the women as well as the men? Another colored minister of the gospel, Elizabeth, was greatly troubled over her call to preach, or more accurately, over the response of men to her call to preach. She said, "I often felt that I was unfit to assemble with the congregation with whom I had gathered. I felt that I was despised on account of this gracious calling, and was looked upon as a speckled bird by the ministers to whom I looked for instruction. Some of the ministers would cry out, 'You are an enthusiast,' and others said, 'The discipline did not allow of any such division of the work.'" How does the self-test principle operate among the poor and the oppressed? Certainly, Black theology has spoken to some of the forms of oppression which exist within the community of the oppressed. Many of the injustices it has attacked are the same as those which gave rise to the prophets in the Old Testament. But the fact that Black theology does not include sexism specifically as one of those injustices is all too evident. It suggests that the theologians do not understand sexism to be one of the oppressive realities of the Black community. Silence on this specific issue can only mean conformity to the status quo. The most prominent Black theologian, James Cone, has already broken this silence. The Black church, like all other churches, is a male-dominated church. The difficulty that Black male ministers have in supporting the equality of women in the church and society stems partly from the lack of a clear liberation criterion rooted in the gospel and in the present struggles of oppressed peoples. It is truly amazing that many black male ministers, young and old, can hear the message of liberation in the gospel when related to racism, but remain deaf to a similar message in the context of sexism. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead here. Section 6 was the bibliographies and bibliographic essays. This was another group of women from the Tuskegee Institute in 1906. I love this time period, and again, like when you look at how interesting it would be to like speak to people from that time period, you know? I think we would have a lot to share. You know, I just look into these kind of images sometimes, and it's just it's really in the grand step of history, like not that long ago. But they seem to be like worlds removed, and I feel like, you know, I feel like the things that just happened in like the past 100 years are just so incredible that it's an interesting piece of, you know, that time period is just really interesting. Um, I think the conversation around like the church and like secular, I agree that a secular place could potentially take the role that churches have. Um, but unfortunately, like it is hard to rally people around those issues sometimes. And, you know, when we look at just, I mean, I hear what Bashant Shaitan is saying about the utility of the Black church. I think that it has been pivotal in certain situations, like, you know, in the civil rights movement of the 1960s or the 50s and 60s, specifically in the South, like the churches were utilized, you know, as a places of organization, which is like why they became targeted. I mean, even if you look at like, I mean, Black churches are still targets of like political terrorism in the U.S. So, I mean, they still are threatening, I think, in many ways to like white supremacists. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's also like within the church, there is like such a thing. There are different like schools of thought, and there are like liberation theologists as well, which I think it's an important grassroots aspect that challenges a lot of the more repressive religious sects that, you know, kind of gain power. I was reading recently in Latin America about how the Pentecostal religion is taking over, and in the US, like the Pentecostals have been like really responsible for a lot of political repression and reactionary organizing. And also, I mean, like I want to say this too, white people use churches to organize. I mean, we need to think about that. Like the whole Pentecostal movement is like, these are community centers that are untaxed, you know, and yeah, the threat of losing nonprofit status if involved in direct political action was hugely depoliticizing. Matthew Nothing says, the meek shall inherit the earth is one of the worst lies that people believe. You have to fight to gain ground against the people who own the world. I don't think that is a lie, but what does it mean to inherit the earth? For me, I've been thinking about that recently, you know. What does it mean to inherit the earth? I mean, I think it's about like, for me, I think it's about like biding our time and knowing when to speak and when to like I want you to think about like who has the most resources as well. Like how do they act? This is the ideology, you know, that kind of Christianity is a huge underpinning of like the ways in which the ruling classes have like through their own actions and behaviors kind of solidified their power. Okay. So like they preach meekness of certain populations than others. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I do, but anyway, so lots of this is all bibliography stuff. So I don't really, I could read you book after book and like article after article, but just know that there's a lot of information out there. African American poets. Oh, wait, we had looked at this and we had talked about maybe Black women composers. So let's kind of on the novels written by selected Black American women. Okay. So novels, articles, criticism even. Oh God, yes. Jessie Fawcett, Zora Neale Hurston is here. Nella Larson. Paula Marshall, Anne Petrie, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker. Those are all Black women included. Black women playwrights. Wow. A listing of non-print materials on Black women. So non-print materials, videotapes, films, artists, performing artists. Like, this is a really amazing reference. Representative films, documentaries, lots about films here. Let's see, and then some of the women they name: Pearl Bailey, Louise Beavers, Dorothy Dandridge, Ruby Dee, Catherine Dunham, Lena Horne, Hattie McDaniels, Claudia McNeil, Bethany McQueen, Diana Ross, Cecily Tyson, Ethel Waters, Leslie Uggams. I mean, yeah. There's a lot. Wow. Additional references and resources. Okay. Doing the work. Selected course syllabi. And this image, students sorting collars and cuffs. This is at Tuskegee as well. Their faces are really obscured in this image, but again, like, look. Collars and cuffs. Ugh. Yeah, this is where it gets, again, this is an academic document. And I want to acknowledge it, but it's like one of those, it was really important historically. Yeah. Ew. So if you would like to set up your own like Black women's studies, I think that like this book could be helpful, for anyone who is interested in that. It's acknowledgments. And then the index. Let's see if there's any more pictures. I don't think so. All right. Well, that was today's look through of this classic piece of Black feminist history. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. I want you to think about this title the next time you think about, like, specifically what Black women are contending with as feminists, and like how valuable like their contributions have been and continue to be. I want to thank like, you know, everyone for being here, but particularly like the Black women who have showed up here and like participated. I appreciate you very much. And I hope you're all doing well. Does anyone have any like closing remarks or statements about this book? What did you appreciate being able to look through it? Are you going to get your own copies? You know, and do you have any recommendations? I mean, I have a lot of recommendations for works by Black women that I think are important to read, but I'm also curious, like, if there's anything anyone would like to recommend. Before I go, ooh, that coffee is strong. I have made 2 cups of very strong coffee today. Oh, damn. Oh, damn. Woo. Well, I mean, I think for my own part too, one thing that I feel inspired to do after reading this is to like, I've been asked several times to do a reading recommendation list. I've been asked, you know, about that many times. And I want to say too, because we have Korean women viewing this, and like this year when some of our Korean sisters came and, you know, were working with and visiting me, I took them to a meeting that was one of, you know, I exposed that. I think in many ways, like I took them into a meeting where white women were discussing racism, and it was interesting to, from the different international perspectives. I think that like it's important to understand the level to with which racism impacts the American women's movement and how it divides us, nationally speaking. Because when we talk about like, well, why don't we have like the same kind of organizing happening here? Like, I think that understanding racism historically and like how society has been divided in the US along these lines is important to understanding, like working with American women specifically. So I want to thank, you know, the international community for being here as well and watching this and making efforts to understand like our particular political situation in the US, which Americans are very much in a bubble culturally a lot. And like, even though our culture, Americans, you know, import a lot of culture, and specifically like Black American culture is imported a lot, you know, addressing this stuff is really pivotal. So I want to just thank everyone for being here and like listening, and I'm glad you all enjoyed it, and I'm glad to see that, you know, some people are going to pick up a copy of this book. It's definitely a really awesome resource. So yeah. And I'm also happy to hear that Shannon is reading Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. I need to read that too. You know, reading Alice Walker this past year really kind of turned me on to the need to read her work. So I'm glad to hear that you're reading her. And yeah, I guess I hope that you're all well. And oh, what else do I want to say? The next time I plan to go live is Monday. I will be doing my Strange Messages show, and I hope to see you there. That'll be at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Really, that's it. That's it. Okay. Have a good day, y'all. Have a good one until we meet again. Keep it strange.